people do feel nervous because they do directly think it's going to impact their role and where they sit. You're almost breaking the organisational structure or hierarchies by forming cross-functional capabilities and cross-functional teams. No real organisation wants to hold a mirror up to themselves a lot of the time.
Welcome to Connected Conversations. I'm Jacqueline Shakespeare, Consulting Partner here at S&S. We recently brought together members from across our S&S communities to explore a challenge that's universal: how to design and measure operating models that connect strategy to execution. We heard how many organisations still measure activity instead of outcomes, struggle to align transformation priority with business strategy, and face silos across teams. We also saw clear interest in moving towards outcome-led measurement, lean governance, and value realisation as a continuous process. It's a topic that couldn't be more relevant right now, as organisations push for faster delivery and more tangible returns from their transformation investments. Sib Singh, consulting principal here at S&S, led the discussions, and so I'm delighted to be joined by him today. Sibbs has over 15 years' experience leading complex global transformation programs and is known for turning ambitious strategies into measurable results, designing operating models that are practical, adaptive, and built for value. In today's conversation, we'll cut through the theory, share real-world lessons, and explore what it takes to keep strategy, execution, and measurement truly connected. Sibbs, welcome.
Thank you.
You've spent much of your career helping organisations transform. What took you into that space?
It's an interesting one, I think, in terms of moving from where I started early in my career around digital marketing. I was lucky enough to start to move in towards more of the strategic engagements as I moved into different consulting practices and different consulting businesses. So, as part of that, I was really fortunate to land in some big projects, one of them being Pandora, which I talked about at the community event. That was much more about some of the low-level delivery around transformation programs, which is more about delivering technology, but actually why we were doing that, and why we were doing that and partnering with Pandora. So looking at that strategic levers and the strategic reasons why a business needs to invest in transformation kind of led me into this space, which is much more about strategy to execution.
And why are you so passionate about it? What makes you get up in the morning?
The people side of business has always been really important to me. So, and a lot of what we hear in the market and what we know is around kind of measures creating behaviors. So how do we measure success, and then what does that link to the people side of the equation if we talk about transformation programs? So I'm always driven by how do we motivate the teams to deliver and how do we empower those teams? And that's kind of something that I really find fascinating in terms of these transformation programs.
And in the community event, you talked a lot about the importance of operating models and the role they play in successful transformation. But not all of us have worked in that space. So when we talk about operating models, what exactly do we mean?
I think in its purest form, when we talk about operating models, it is the way that an organization or an enterprise aims to implement its strategic plans. So, that's still quite consulting speak, I think, but in essence, it is about the business and leadership are setting an objective or a goal. How they get there is about how you design an operating model and function within the operating model space.
And is that the same irrespective of industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's always nuances when it comes to industries and even individual businesses because of, again, it goes back to the people point. Leadership structures are often governed by the way that the types of leaders and the types of personalities and experiences you have within that leadership. So there's always going to be nuances, but the whole point about designing operating models is then linked to how does a business grow, retain, how does it establish itself in the market. All of that remains the same across industries and across markets. The whole view is that how you then design the operating model to service that need or that strategic goal is what the focus is around that.
So when an organisation embeds and adopts an operating model, which may continue to mature over time, does that then, protect is probably the wrong word, but does that help them to thrive in a world where customer needs are changing and market forces changing?
If it's based and grounded in the data side of what the customer needs are and what the market says, then that always serves a purpose initially. But it isn't a set operating model that you then have to implement and not change. So this whole as is and to be kind of approach to operating models
Mm.
is not really relevant in terms of what businesses are trying to achieve. It has to be something that you bake in that is more about how you continuously review the operating model based on customer and market need. That's where a lot of businesses, I think, trip up in terms of how they're designing operating models, or how the traditional operating model
Mm.
design work is kind of factored in.
And when it just made me think of something. So when we're talking about tripping up, quite often when I'm working with clients,
Yeah.
hear that they are working on a new operating model, and then it transpires that actually they're revising their OD, so their org
Yeah.
design.
Yes.
Is that something that you come across a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've done some recent work with the client, and they want to move towards a more customer-centric operating model, but they fundamentally don't know what an operating model is. So we almost kicked off the workshops and the sessions in the intro, doing some jargon busting. So we said what is an operating model and what isn't. And when we talk about org design, operating structures and structural roles within the business, so the hierarchy, that is absolutely not operating model design, because the operating model, going back to what we said, is about how a business implements their strategy
Mm.
and their strategic plans. So it's meant to be based on what they already have and how they're structured. And then you also look at how you can make the most of your processes, your technology, your capabilities. We talk a lot about capabilities and operating model design. So what we're purposely trying to do is not focus on the hierarchy and the structure
Mm.
and the org design within a business, because that then changes the conversation around what the business is trying to achieve and get the outcome. Um, so yeah, we always have this conflict, and there is a lead from the operating model design to provide recommendations on how the future of the organization could look,
Mm.
but it shouldn't change the structure or the organizational design. I'd say that's a separate piece of work.
So one of the things that I've seen around when we've talked about not when we've talked about operation models, but in the context of organisations, is almost a circle with different buckets in there
Yeah.
of technology, process, people.
Mm.
Is that something that you recognise? And the reason I'm asking that is because I'm just trying to think of a really simplistic way of explaining. I heard your definition earlier, but what's the breadth of an operating model's scope? What does it touch? I'm just trying to think of it in simplistic terms for people.
I think, again, it goes back to, if it is, I don't think the operating model flow for a lot of the work that we do and the work that clients are looking for isn't about the whole org, isn't about the enterprise as a
Mm.
whole.
Okay.
It is about serving and meeting that specific strategic need for the client. So, and for the business. So, what you're then designing from an operating model perspective, especially when we're talking about those transformation programs, there is a direct strategic need for that operating model. So what they're trying to do is design the model to meet that strategic
Mm.
need, which means it has to factor in potentially anything within the organization that could impact delivering against that strategic goal.
Mm.
So that means it could touch process technology, could even touch compliance and legal elements of the business to go and deliver. So, but it might not.
So if somebody's listening to it and they go, right, okay, so it would be there would be lines and edges around it in a way because
Absolutely.
it's about delivering to a specific strategic need. If if that work's done and it works really well,
Mm.
is that something that an organisation potentially then scales out across an organisation, or is it literally that pocket and something different would need to be done for another strategic imperative or ambition?
It could be one or the other. I think the best, or from my experience, the ones that work most effectively are the ones that can scale. So, you identify an area of the business that may need to be improved against. I worked with a global toy manufacturer, for example, who wanted to move from a B2B business to more of a B2C, so the direct to consumer business.
Mhm.
So the way you design the operating model is to focus on a specific region, design the operating model within that region to then shift and pivot their teams to direct to consumer, and then effectively roll that out in other regions. So that could be a way of doing it that helps them scale, rather than this a big bang. We do a whole, or we consider the whole enterprise and then roll out a new operating model. They're always more effective in that way.
And from an organisational point of view, that de-risks the work
Yeah.
because you're actually looking at a smaller part of the organisation. It's not enterprise wide, which can be quite daunting,
Yeah.
really, when you're looking at transformation and
Yeah,
change.
and I think going back to what you said around the kind of the blurred lines between organizational design and structure, whenever you talk about operating models
Mm.
at the moment or in general, um, people do feel nervous because they do directly think it's going to impact their role and where they sit.
Mm.
And so, um, that that's something that you need to kind of help flow through in terms of the impact on the people downstream as well.
When you are working with organisations at the beginning of their journey, and inevitably there's going to be some nervousness around some different things.
Mm.
You just named one there. Are there other things that typically organisations are a bit more apprehensive about as they start this journey?
No one in their role or no real organization wants to hold a mirror up to themselves a lot of the time. People
Yep.
don't like being told that they're not doing something, or they should do something differently. And I think that's one of the things that involved in being involved in transformation all the time is change is kind of a constant.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean that everyone's comfortable in that space. So a lot of the work that needs to be done up front is kind of getting buy-in, helping mobilize, helping communicate the reason and rationale
Mm.
around why you're trying to do this. So, and that kind of goes back to what we said around the strategic need of an organization.
Mm.
You need to be able to articulate that at every level of your organization before you embark upon designing new operating model or new ways of working, so that everyone understands exactly
Mm.
why they're on the journey and what it
Mm.
means for them.
So, I mean, I use the phrase bright spot sometimes in terms of when there's a lot of change going on. Sometimes it can feel all quite challenging and difficult, but actually look for the bright spots and amplify those.
Mm.
If you're or when you're starting to work with an organisation and they're looking very carefully about what they're about to embark on,
Mm.
what do you look for in the bright spots? And the reason I'm asking that question is because we've talked before about sponsorship, for example,
Mm.
and actually when you have a really strong sponsor in place, the brilliance or the influence of that on the whole piece of work. So, what are the bright spots that you look for early on?
It's a really interesting one at the moment because it's a question. A lot of it is about, you go into a company and you speak to all of the stakeholders, and you obviously have a good sponsor because you're already embedded in there and you're doing some work. But you find that there are change agents and detractors essentially. So the biggest opportunity is to empower the change agents to turn the detractors into those bright spots, I would say.
Yeah.
Because we're not, what I don't want to do is come in and say, you should do X and expect everyone to follow. I think if you're seeing the change happening internally as you're designing and you're rolling out new ways of
Mm.
working, that's where the benefit comes.
And the power of that peer-to-peer influence
Absolutely,
rather
yeah.
than somebody from the
Yeah.
outside, as you say. Yeah.
And that has to start at the sponsor level and down. I think if you've got a strong enough sponsor who empowers those people within his organization or their organization to um to understand and take on what it means to change at their level and within their role, that is much more powerful than an us versus them kind of approach in terms of, we will tell you what's going to change and you're going to change.
Mm.
I just don't think that ever works.
So, whatever the journey or the shape of the operating model, it sounds like it's only ever really successful if you've got the right culture in place.
Hmm.
What are the key skills, behaviours, capabilities that organisations need to be successful?
I think the challenge is that it might not necessarily be specifically about skills or roles within the organization. One of the key things that I kind of advocate for when we start this kind of work is to almost co-design that team with
Mm.
the client or with our kind of key sponsors and key stakeholders on the client side. Because some of those kind of diamonds in the rough within the business might not necessarily sit within any of their business units. That's one of the things that I've found really interesting, and I think we're still in this phase. When we talk to clients, we're still in this phase where business, traditional business functions and IT and technology are still fairly siloed sometimes.
Mm.
And the magic is when you bring some of these silos together. So when you model that team who are responsible for helping go on this journey, it should be representation. There should be representation against those key areas of the business. Um, the skills then has to cross cut against that as well. So, you have business representation. So if it's something specific to marketing, for example, you are going to have marketing representation, anyone who can highlight what the customer need is within that marketing space is going to be really important. And then how you move into delivering against that is then more of a technology delivery compliance kind of space. So you're almost starting to mold the type of ways of working by modeling that team. You see what I mean?
So cross-functional teams, again, a really interesting one because it's hard to set up a truly cross-functional team, isn't it? And lots of organisations try because the benefits are pretty well understood in that space and really important as well when we're talking about operating models, no doubt,
Yeah.
whether it's around value realization or adaptability. So tell me a little bit about the roles that cross-functional teams play in op model
Yeah.
space.
It goes back to what you said around the difference between org design and structure and operating models. You're almost breaking the organizational structure or hierarchies by forming cross-functional capabilities and cross-functional teams to deliver against your strategic goal. So it's kind of conflicting between the two in terms of the way the business operates, which is why you said it's difficult. Um, but the role they play is that as you develop these cross-functional teams, you are identifying key people within the organization or key roles within the organization who should be empowered and autonomous enough to go after an area of value or a delivery need or etc., depending on the outcome that you're trying to get to. Um, so that is almost creating a little squad of people who can go after an area of value, as I mentioned. Now that could be a representative from the business, a representative from legal, a representative from policy. It could involve your vendors or your partners. You know, there's a real mishmash in terms of what those roles look like. The key thing is that they have an outcome that they need to go after. Um, and if that's the way we set it up, then it's mostly going to be successful. If you're just setting it up for the sake of setting up cross-functional teams, people aren't going to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, why it's different to what they do day to day. That's where businesses do trip up sometimes.
And of course, one of the real joys of cross-functional teams as well is giving people the space to thrive. So I always find quite often you see people who are utterly brilliant coming forth that haven't been really noticed before because they haven't had the autonomy, the empowerment, they haven't had that space and people having confidence in them to actually to bring their best selves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Mm.
I think a lot of the work where we try to align it to maybe a customer journey or a value stream, um, because it becomes something that every person in the business can link themselves to in terms of their purpose. It brings out the best in people. So, like you said, someone who may not necessarily be used to providing their point of view or providing an angle, it gives them the space to actually think about what it means for their role and what they do within the business, and then how does that contribute to the outcome. That's a really good mechanism, I think.
So we talked a lot about measurement and value realization. What do we see when an operating model is working well?
Yeah, so I think we didn't go into too much detail around the measurement side of how we build the operating model, but the ones that I've seen that are most successful is you basically build in a link between the strategic objectives and the OKRs, which are kind of objectives, key results, but some people call them KPIs for the end team. So I talked about the outcome that end team may want to go after. That should be tangibly linked to the strategic objectives and then cascaded down through the transformation program. That can be through leveled objectives, it could be through leveled targets. But essentially, that team on the ground knows what they're going after and that they can track that back to the strategic objective. So, if we get that bit right and the model works, you know that you're going to be meeting objectives ongoing on an ongoing basis. If you're not, then there may be a consideration of how you pivot or redesign or tweak the operating model to work. So that I think that the key thing there is that some of those objectives need to be based on ways of working and based on some of the measures that you need to have effective, high performing teams. If you don't do that and it's only about revenue or customer experience, you aren't going to see or be able to measure effectiveness of the operating model.
What conversations are you having with clients right now? What's of the moment? What's the work that's going on today?
What was really refreshing is obviously the opportunity to run the community events
Mm.
around strategy to execution and just talk about the experience and the way that we structure things that we talked about today. Off the back of that, we've had two clients get in touch with us, wanting to ask about how one of them was about they have quite an established portfolio to product um,
Mhm.
way of creating value within their business. But what they're struggling with is this kind of value realization piece. So, how do you realize the value of what your product teams are delivering? So, we're currently in the throes of talking to them about how you design a value realization office, which is essentially structured around essentially how you prioritize and and track ROI around your in-flight product team deliveries. So that sounds very complicated, but essentially it goes back to what we just said, which is how do you manage continuous value realization downstream, and how do you decide what's working and what's not at the leadership level? The other client is talking more about the OKRs with their product teams. So, what are those objectives and key results within their product teams, and are they being tracked properly? Are they actually linked back to what the business is trying to achieve? So, there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of, again, downstream delivery and strategic objectives. So that kind of space really resonated
Mm.
in terms of what we discussed.
SNS is known for mission-based working.
Mm.
And a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the last few minutes have reminded me of either the principles
Yeah.
or the approach that we take, whether it's you know, going in narrow before scaling, or cross-functional teams, or aligning to strategy. So,
Yep.
can you explain how, if we work with someone around an operating model versus mission-based working, what's the difference?
We talked about adaptive operating
Mm.
models a little bit, and the upfront design of an operating model, if that is where we get to with the client, the potential starting point in terms of how you test and scale an operating model is
Mm.
is mission-based working essentially. So I talked previously about an outcome or being aligned to a journey. Um, the journey could be the mission. So depending on how we frame it and how we design the outcome, it could become a mission in the way that we talk about missions. Again, it very much depends on the outcome. How you then test it and scale it is almost that narrow scope glass tube approach where you cross cut against the business,
Right.
and you go and design and build based on that, because that is a proof point
Mm.
for the rest of the organization in terms of you are going after a certain amount of value, you're testing new ways of working, and then you're able to scale that elsewhere. I think it's one and the same. We may just talk about it slightly differently, but I think there's definitely an area in terms of how mission-based working can help accelerate operating
Mm.
model design
Okay.
within a business.
So, for leaders watching this and wondering what to do next, what's your advice for how to get started?
You know, a lot of it goes down to life cycle of where the business is at. So, you know, businesses in general are struggling with various different needs depending on the market, depending on what they're trying to achieve as a business. I think from a leadership perspective, it's also challenging. Are you getting the most out of your people? And are you getting the most out of your people against what you're trying to achieve as a business?
Mm.
If you're coming up against barriers and you're coming up against areas that may need to be considered, there's definitely an opportunity to look at the operating
Yeah.
model. The other side of what we're seeing a lot of at the moment, which is slightly side side conversation for what we're talking about today, but businesses have set up kind of a good portfolio structure for how they run their enterprise, and how that then flows into delivery and into how you run your projects and your BAU. Um, that has been set up for a long time in most businesses.
Mm.
There are now gaps surfacing around how you move from portfolio and kind of the value around your portfolio into delivery.
Mm.
A lot of that's because of this disruption from technology. We talk a lot about AI at the moment, but AI is almost cutting across that portfolio. So then how do you start to incorporate that into your planning, your funding cycles and your strategies? I think that's a really good opportunity to start to look about how you set up your operating models to deliver value and deliver transformation into the business.
There's a lot.
There's a lot to
There's a
unpack
lot
there, which is
to
why I
all of
said I
this.
sidetracked, but
So, if I was listening to this, I might feel a little bit, start to feel a little bit overwhelmed by
yeah.
everything in front of me. So, if somebody listening to this was to have a conversation with you
Yeah.
around operating models, what kind of conversation could they expect to have?
Hopefully fairly grounded in terms of what they're trying to achieve, what are their ambitions, and also what are their kind of pain points at the moment. I think when we talk about transformation specifically, a lot of it becomes kind of program based. So, you know, they're either undertaking a large transformation program already, or they might be about to start one. And so often that is often outcome based, but also solution based in terms of we need to build X or we need to deliver X, Y, Z. And then the operating model is an afterthought. So what we want to do is bring that forward in terms of the conversation and say, how are you actually going to deliver this? And how does this impact your business? So remove the end goal or the ambition almost and say, break it down into its constituent parts. That really resonates with clients because it helps them understand that actually the roadmap to where you need to get to is very different to what they actually think they need sometimes. Um, and, I think from a consulting perspective, that's the only reason we're there is to kind of challenge and give some outside in experience. So those are the kind of conversations. Now that can be a typical conversation, or it could be a workshop to make sure that the team and the people involved from their side get what they need out of a session and know where they're going in terms of the next steps. Um, but yeah, it's a little bit challenging, a little bit questioning in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And then it doesn't necessarily end up always being about an operating model. There might just be some problems to be solved from a change management perspective, for example, or from an alignment around strategy. Um, those are the kind of conversations that we're having at the moment, and how I can help, I suppose.
Thank you so much for talking to me about this today. It's been really interesting. And thank you for taking something that is so broad potentially for an organisation to get their arms around and sounds like it could be so complicated. But actually, what I'm hearing from you is first thing you do is unpack everything,
Yeah.
which immediately will make it seem simpler and more and easier to approach and tackle. And then you take a sensible approach to make sure you're delivering the value that the organisation needs.
Yeah, I think again the most successful programs are the ones that make it as simple as possible for everyone to understand. If we make it complicated, then how is it going to be adopted within the business? It's not. So I think that's always why it's much better to kind of have the conversation and break it down together.
If you bring the elements we've discussed together, measurable outcomes, adaptability, and a strong human foundation, you're not just designing an operating model, you're building a living system that can deliver sustained value. At Sullivan and Stanley, we help organisations connect strategy to execution through operating models that are adaptive, measurable, and focused on value realisation. If you're watching and want to make sure your transformation delivers on its promise, connect with us on LinkedIn or drop us a message through our website to start a conversation. Together, we can design operating models that turn ambition into lasting impact.